we will start the lecture here.
There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Third to the 12th pairs of cranial nerves arise from the brainstem. The motor cranial nerves are actually the lower motor neurons of the descending pathway, and the sensory cranial nerves are actually the first order neurons of the ascending pathway. Cell bodies of cranial nerves are located in the brainstem, and they are called cranial nerve nuclei. The nuclei of the motor cranial nerves are actually the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons of the descending pathway, therefore. And the nuclei of the sensory cranial nerves are actually the cell bodies of the second order neurons of the ascending pathway. When you studied the spinal nerves and the spinal cord, you learned that the first order neuron cell bodies of the sensory nerves lie in the dorsal root ganglion outside the spinal cord. Similar to that, the first order neuron cell bodies of the sensory cranial nerves also lie outside the brain, in ganglia. Trigeminal ganglion of the trigeminal nerve, geniculate ganglion of the facial nerve, and the ganglia on the vestibulocochlear nerve are examples.
Okay, now I will stop here for a moment. Now, when it comes to the cranial nerves, you know that there are 12 cranial nerves, and the first thing is to know that there are 12 cranial nerves. Then the second thing is to know their correct spellings. Okay, so the first one is the olfactory nerve. The first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, and the second one is the optic nerve. Third one, the oculomotor nerve. You can see it in the slide. Then the fourth, trochlear. Fifth, trigeminal. Sixth, abducens or abducent. You can write it in both ways. C-E-N-S-O-C-E-N-T, abducent or abducens. Then the seventh cranial nerve is the facial nerve. Eighth one is vestibulocochlear nerve. Actually, there are two parts to it, a vestibular part and a cochlear part. One is for hearing, the other one is for balance. Then the ninth cranial nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve. 10th, vagus. 11th, accessory. And 12th, hypoglossal nerve. Those are the 12 cranial nerves. Know their spellings and be able to write them down properly. Now the first two cranial nerves, the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, they are attached to the cerebrum. They arise from the cerebrum, and there are no connections with the brainstem when it comes to the first two cranial nerves. From the third to the 12th cranial nerve, they all arise from the brainstem. Therefore, their cell bodies of the neurons are found in the brainstem. So that is what we are discussing in the first part of this lecture. I will share the whiteboard. So if this is your the spinal cord. Okay, this is your spinal cord. This is your central canal. If I draw the sensory nerve coming into the spinal cord, okay, your sensory nerve is like this, having the cell body of the first neuron outside and coming into the spinal cord, posterior horn of the spinal cord like that. So this forms the dorsal root ganglion in relation to the spinal nerves. Then your second order neuron of the sensory nerves synapse with the first order neuron in the dorsal root. Then it crosses in front of the central canal and ascend on the other side of the spinal cord. Now this is the example of lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts for pain, temperature type of sensations. Then when it comes to the brain stem, now if this is your midbrain, and if this is your pons, and if this is your medulla, a simple diagram, again the sensory component of cranial nerves, they also come in like that and having the cell body, first order neuron cell body outside the central nervous system and comes into the brainstem like that. Then the second order neuron starts on the same side of the brain stem and crosses to the opposite side and ascends on that side. Okay, so that is the usual rule. And therefore, in relation to the cranial nerves, again, the first order neuron sensory cell bodies form cranial nerve ganglia. Outside the central nervous system, you can find some of these ganglia in the cranial cavity and some in the petrous temporal bone, like that. So here you had dorsal root ganglion. Here you have ganglia of cranial nerves. That's the only difference. Then the other point is, now when you talk about the sensory nuclei, okay, it's nuclei. Sensory nuclei of cranial nerves, usually it is the cell bodies of the second order neuron that you call the sensory nucleus of the cranial nerve. Okay, because the first one is anyway outside. There are exceptions, one or two, but usually this is the case. Okay, now when it comes to motor neurons, in relation to the spinal cord, you know that there is the cell bodies of the motor neurons lie in the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and they come out as the lower motor neuron or the final common pathway. Okay, so this is in the anterior nerve root of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the anterior nerve root, this is the posterior nerve root, you know that. Then here in the brainstem, again the same rule, you have the motor cell bodies in the brainstem like this, and the lower motor neuron comes out like that. So these are the nerve fibers that are motor nerve fibers that are found in the cranial nerves. Therefore, the cell bodies of the motor neurons, the lower motor neuron, form the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves. Okay, so that is the rule in the cranial nerve. Then again, when it comes to the spinal cord, you have this lateral horns in the spinal cord in the thoracolumbar region. In other regions, even though the lateral horn is not visible, but still the autonomic nerve cells are found in that area, in this area. And the sympathetic fibers, the sympathetic motor nerves, which start from the lateral horn of the spinal cord, they also come out in the anterior nerve root and go with the spinal nerve. Same rule here, only difference is you don't have sympathetic coming out from the brain or the brain stem, because we have already discussed that the parasympathetic has a craniosacral outflow and sympathetic has a thoracolumbar outflow. So only in the thoracic and lumbar regions you should expect sympathetic fibers to come out from the central nervous system, and when it comes to the brain and the brainstem and the sacral region, it is the parasympathetic fibers that comes out from the central nervous system. So the autonomic fibers you get here are the parasympathetic fibers, and the preganglionic neurons, you know the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of autonomic nerves. Okay, the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nerves come out with the cranial nerve, different cranial nerves, we will discuss that, and then cell bodies will lie in the brainstem again, so they will form what is called the parasympathetic nucleus. Then the only difference compared to the spinal cord is that you actually assign these parasympathetic nuclei to adjacent cranial nerve main motor nuclei. For instance, oculomotor nerve has a motor nucleus and an accessory motor nucleus, so parasympathetic motor nucleus, because that one, the fibers of the parasympathetic nucleus closer to the oculomotor nerve will go with the oculomotor nerve. Therefore, you call it the parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. That's the only difference. Okay, and when it comes to the parasympathetic, this preganglionic fiber synapses with the postganglionic fiber, which supplies the ultimate muscle organ, and that forms the parasympathetic ganglion outside. Okay, it's a ganglion that lies outside. So this when it comes to the sympathetic system, what you had was the sympathetic chain with a chain of ganglia like that. We discussed it, I think, in one of the lectures. So remember, this two order neurons are there in the sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic system, the preganglionic fiber is short and there is a long postganglionic fiber. Parasympathetic is the opposite. There's a short postganglionic fiber. So then The other important point that you have to remember is that some cranial nerves will have only this motor component. Okay, some cranial nerves will have the motor component, that one and this one, sympathetic and the parasympathetic and motor, both. Then some cranial nerves will have only sensory component, and some cranial nerves will have all three components: a sensory component, then a motor component, and a parasympathetic component. Okay, so that is an important point for you to remember. Then the other important point is when it comes to sympathetic. When it comes to sympathetic, now head region, since there is no sympathetic outflow from the brain, you don't expect sympathetic to come with the cranial nerves. Okay, so sympathetic will never come from the cranial nerves, but you have to have sympathetic supply in the head region as well. So you have to borrow sympathetic from the sympathetic chains. So you have your sympathetic chain like this with ganglia. Now if this is your say thorax, if this is your neck, and if this is your thorax, the upper end of the sympathetic chain goes into the neck. Okay, and this is called the cervical part of the sympathetic chain. In that cervical part of the sympathetic chain, because even though the outflow is thoracolumbar, because of upward and downward movement of the fibers, it goes into the neck. Not that there is outflow from the cervical area. Okay, it's only thoracolumbar outflow. But then there are certain ganglia in the neck in relation to the sympathetic chain. There is a ganglion called the uppermost ganglion, which is called superior cervical ganglion. Superior cervical means neck. Superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic chain. Then there's another one called stellate, and there are ganglia like that. Okay. So from the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic chain, the postganglionic fibers that are coming out. Okay, so the postganglionic fibers and preganglionic fibers now. They actually go with the common carotid artery and then the internal carotid artery. Common carotid artery and internal carotid artery, and with the internal carotid artery, it enters the cranial cavity. It can go with other branches of these coronary arteries as well. Ultimately, what happens is you get parasympathetic through cranial nerves. You get sympathetic from the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic chain from the neck through blood vessels. Okay, so that is the basic rule behind this. So this is all I have to explain at this moment. We'll revisit this if I think it's necessary when the video runs. Okay.
When you study cranial nerves, you need to pay attention to the following aspects of cranial nerves: the position of nucleus in the brainstem, the emerging point of the cranial nerve from the brainstem, the intracranial course of the cranial nerve, the point of exit from the cranial cavity through the foramina in the base of the skull, extracranial course, and the distribution. Here the distribution means the structures supplied by the cranial nerves. Now we will take a look at the meaning of these three terms that will be important when we discuss the cranial nerves: somatic, branchial, and visceral. Now, during the early development, the mesoderm is separated out into three areas: the paraxial mesoderm on either side of the neural tube and the notochord, and then there is intermediate mesoderm, and then the lateral plate mesoderm. Now this paraxial mesoderm, which is on either side of the neural tube, gets condensed and forms a series of segments. You can see a series of segments here. Now this series of segments are called somites. Each somite gets divided into a dermatome, myotome, and a sclerotome. Sclerotome will give rise to the vertebra. The dermatome will give rise to skin, and myotome will give rise to muscles. The spinal nerve arising from the spinal segment formed in this area supplies the dermatome developing from the same somite, and the myotome developing from the same somite. You already know the definition of dermatome. The dermatome is an area of skin supplied by a single spinal nerve or spinal cord segment. And a myotome is muscle or muscles supplied by a single spinal nerve or spinal cord segment. Now, the reason for this definition is the fact that they develop from the same somite and supplied by the spinal nerve of that spinal segment. When it comes to the head and neck region, some of the muscles, skin, bones, cartilages and ligaments in the head and neck region develop from what are called branchial arches. And the branchial arches, when they give rise to structures, there is an arch nerve that goes with the structures and supplies it. So for instance, the first arch nerve is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, and the second arch nerve is the facial nerve, and so on. Therefore, in the head and neck region, the nerves that supply the structures developing from the branchial arches are called branchial nerves. Now, in the previous one, the nerves that supply the structures developing from the skin and the muscles developing from the somites are called somatic nerves, and here the nerves are called branchial nerves. And when it comes to the internal organs, the visceral organs like heart, gut, lungs, and blood vessels, the nerves that supply these structures are called visceral nerves. So this is how these three definitions, the terms come into existence. Somatic in relation to the somites, branchial in relation to the structures developing from branchial arches, and visceral in relation to the internal organs. This is a diagrammatic representation of some of the structures developing from branchial arches and the arch nerves. You can see some of the middle ear bones, the ossicles, middle ear ossicles, and the mandible developing from the first branchial arch, and the nerve that supplies structures or muscles related to these structures is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. All muscles of mastication will come under this category, developing from the first arch mesoderm. Then the muscles and other structures developing from the second pharyngeal arch is indicated here, and the muscles, which are the muscles of facial expression, developed from the second pharyngeal arch, mesoderm, is supplied by the facial nerve. So the first arch nerve is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, and the second arch nerve is the facial nerve. Likewise, the third arch nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve, fourth arch nerve is the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve, and the sixth arch nerve is the recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. Fifth arch disappears during the development. So all these nerves, therefore, have a branchial motor component to supply these structures developing from the branchial arch mesoderm. When it comes to the extraocular muscles in the head and neck region and the muscles of the tongue, they actually develop from the myotomes in the occipital area which migrate, and therefore the nerves that supply the extraocular muscles and the tongue muscles, even though they are in the head region, still the nerve supply is a somatic nerve supply. So we will get back to it when we do these particular nerves supplying these extraocular muscles and the muscles of the tongue. I will give you a few hints about the arrangement of cranial nerves, so that when it comes to each cranial nerve, when we discuss them, you can easily understand the points related to it.
Coming back to a small discussion again, when it comes to different nerve fibers, you know you have motor nerve fibers, then you have sensory nerve fibers. Then motor ones, you have somatic ones which are developing from somites according to the description that was given. Then when it comes to the head and neck region, you have another new component which is called branchial, because certain head and neck structures, especially head structures, develop from a special mesoderm called branchial mesoderm, which develops at a later stage than the somites. But the only difference is certain structures in the head region, like the muscles of the tongue, extraocular muscles, they develop from the occipital area. Somites in the occipital area, then they migrate into the front, the tongue or the orbit. Therefore, in the head region, it's not always branchial. It can, some of the cranial nerves have somatic as well, like in the spinal nerves. Okay, but except for one cranial nerve, which is a very peculiar one, the 11th cranial nerve, it has a lot of issues. I will let you know later. All other cranial nerves, they never have somatic and branchial in the same cranial nerve. It's either somatic or branchial. The motor component, the main motor component, is either somatic or branchial. Only difference is the cranial 11th cranial nerve, which is the accessory nerve, because it's a peculiar nerve. Okay, so if you take any other nerve, it's either somatic or branchial when it comes to the motor component. Then there's another motor component which is the parasympathetic, but that is autonomic. Okay, that is not under voluntary control. So these are the motor components that can be there. So then when it comes to sensory, again you have somatic. You have a somatic component because you get sensations coming from the skin. Then you have visceral. Visceral is in relation to the internal organs. Okay, so if you take tongue or any other internal organ like blood vessels, the sensations that you're getting is visceral. Then when it comes to the head region, the other issue is you get special sensations. Special sensations. What are the special sensations? Vision, then you take with the first one, smell, vision, then taste and hearing. So then these things are also there in the head region. So these are special sensations. Now here, since we are discussing cranial nerves, and we are concentrating on the brainstem, because the first two cranial nerves, they are anyway going into the cerebrum, because you will not find because of that you will not find nuclei of those cranial nerves in the brainstem. So therefore these two, even though they are special sensations, unless you discuss those two cranial nerves, you will not find nuclei or anything in the brainstem. Okay, so that's, you will not have an issue with that. Then the taste is a visceral special sensation. It's a visceral because it's an internal organ. It's a visceral special sensation. So either you can call it visceral special visceral, or you can just call it taste. Then hearing, it's related to the 8th cranial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve. So it comes into the brainstem. Okay, so we will have to discuss it. That is also special. Okay, but that is not taken as visceral. Okay, because it's an external thing. So you take it as a special somatic sensation. Okay, special somatic sensation. Okay, But the only special somatic sensation when it comes to cranial nerves, the only special somatic sensation is hearing, therefore. Okay. Then the only visceral, special visceral sensation is taste. So taste is related to the 7th cranial nerve, and the 9th cranial nerve. 7th and 9th, we'll discuss that, okay, in a moment. 7th and 9th cranial nerves. Hearing is related to the 8th cranial nerve. Okay, these two will only come under the 1st cranial nerve and the 2nd cranial nerve, not coming into the brainstem. Then the other point is, when it comes to the motor component and sensory component, now some cranial nerves will have somatic component and parasympathetic component, and any of the sensory components. Some will have branchial component and some parasympathetic component and somatic visceral sensory component. So you can have different combinations. Okay, I would not say that they will have all the combinations. Okay, but you take one by one nerves and learn it. Don't get confused when you have more than one component. Okay, you can have more than one component. Even in the spinal nerves, you know that we call them mixed nerves because they have somatic component, somatic motor, somatic sensory, then visceral motor, visceral sensory, all that. Okay, so it's not different when it comes to cranial nerves. You can have different combinations of these components. Only thing is there is an additional branchial component and additional special sensory component in the neck region. Okay, and when you get these different components in cranial nerves, you call them functional components of cranial nerves.
Now in this example, you can see a set of nerve fibers indicated in black, supplying a muscle. Therefore, if this muscle is a muscle that developed from Somite myotomes, then these nerve fibers should be somatic motor nerve fibers. And on the other hand, if this muscle developed from branchial arch mesoderm, then the nerve fibers that supply this muscle should be branchial motor fibers. Now this the second set of nerve fibers indicated in blue here, they supply a gland. If a set of nerve fibers supply a gland or a smooth muscle, then it should be visceral. It should be visceral. So this is a visceral motor nerve. This is a visceral motor nerve. And visceral motor could be either sympathetic or parasympathetic. And the third example, you can see skin here. So there are a set of sensory nerve fibers taking sensations from the skin and taking it to the brain. So if sensations are taken from the skin, then it should be a somatic sensory or somatic sensory nerve. Somatic sensory nerve. And if these sensations were taken from an organ, internal organ, it should be a visceral sensory nerve fibers. And the other thing is, as we have discussed before, the first order neurons of the sensory nerves in the head and neck region, they have their cell bodies, first order neuron cell bodies outside the brain in the form of a ganglia. So this is a ganglia. And the cell bodies of the second order neuron will form the nucleus of the sensory nerve within the brainstem. Now this will show you something else. Now there is a nerve called nerve B here, and you can see these sensory nerve fibers that we were discussing. They actually go with nerve B for some distance before it reaches nerve A, its original nerve. Now this phenomenon is called hitchhiking because the nerve fibers that originally belong to nerve A hitchhike with nerve B, go with nerve B so that it can easily reach its destination. So this phenomenon also is seen when you discuss the cranial nerves in the head and neck region. We'll get back to these points when we discuss the actual cranial nerves. This is an image of the neural tube before the brain and the spinal cord are formed. If we split the neural tube in the middle like this, posterior half, the grey matter, will contain cell bodies of sensory neurons, and the grey matter of the anterior half will contain the cell bodies of motor neurons. In the posterior half, which is the sensory half, further behind you get the somatic sensory nerve cell bodies, and in front of it there is visceral sensory cell bodies. In the anterior half, in the anterior end, you get the somatic motor cell bodies, and behind that you get the visceral motor cell bodies located. So visceral sensory and visceral motor cell bodies lie on either side of the line we divided. Once the spinal cord develops, if you look at the picture in the spinal cord, this is the somatic sensory nerve with the first order neuron cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion here, and this is the cell bodies of the second order neuron lying here at the posterior end of the posterior half. This is a motor neuron, somatic motor neuron, having the cell bodies in the anterior end, which is the anterior horn of the grey matter. This is the posterior horn of the grey matter. Then, so this is actually the anterior horn cells here. So this is the visceral sensory nerve having the sensory cell bodies immediately behind the line we divided the spinal cord into anterior and posterior halves, and this is the visceral motor cell bodies. The neural tube splits at the back and opens up here to form the fourth ventricle of the brainstem. Therefore, when the brainstem is formed, at the floor of the fourth ventricle, the nuclei of the cranial nerves are arranged from medial to lateral rather than from anterior to posterior. But the position of the cranial nerve nuclei is maintained based on the original arrangement. Therefore, the somatic motor cell bodies lie very close to the midline. So they lie most medially in the brainstem, floor of the fourth ventricle of the brainstem. Then the visceral motor ones, which are here actually in the original arrangement, they lie further laterally. The visceral sensory ones lie lateral to the visceral motor, which is this one, and the somatic sensory lies further laterally. When it comes to the head and neck region, as we have discussed before, there are branchial motor nerves. The cell bodies of branchial motor nerves lie between the somatic motor and visceral motor in this place. And when it comes to the head, there are special sensations like vision, smell, hearing and taste. Because of that, the somatic sensory component here is divided into two components: special somatic sensory, general somatic sensory here, and the special somatic sensory further laterally. But you need to remember one thing here: the vision, the optic nerve for vision is not part of the brainstem. It bypasses the brainstem and it does not have nuclei in the brainstem. And the olfactory nerve for smell is also not entering the brainstem and has no nuclei in the brainstem. Therefore, the special somatic sensory nucleus here will not have any relationship with the vision and smell, with the optic nerve and the olfactory nerves. Then when it comes to taste, it is taken as a visceral sensory, special visceral sensory thing. Therefore, that also does not come under special somatic sensory. The only thing left for special somatic sensory, therefore, is hearing coming through the vestibulocochlear nerve. Types of sensory components we found in the head and neck region. The basic two types of sensory components, as you already know, are the visceral sensory and the somatic sensory components. The visceral sensory component has two components in it, the general visceral sensory component and the special visceral sensory component. The general visceral sensory component is pain, temperature and touch arising from internal organs, the visceral organs and blood vessels. And the only special visceral sensation is the taste. Then general somatic sensations are the pain, temperature, touch, vibration and position sense, and the only special somatic sensation is the hearing carried through the vestibulocochlear nerve.
Now the point here is, if you take an organ like tongue, you can feel taste through taste buds in the tongue. So that's a special visceral sensation. You can just call it taste. No need to call it special visceral all the time. Then at the same time, if you touch your tongue, you feel it. If you use some hot object on the tongue, if you just drink very hot water, you will have the pain, okay, of the tongue, and the temperature also you feel. So these are actually general sensations. Since we are referring to a visceral organ, inside organ, then they become general visceral sensations. Okay, so the same general sensations like pain, touch, temperature, these are felt through the skin. So where they are felt through the skin, you call them general somatic sensations. Okay, so that's the only difference here.
Before we discuss the individual cranial nerves, we will take a look at how these different functional components are included in the different cranial nerves. If you take the first functional component, which is somatic motor component, this component is carried in the cranial nerves listed here. The third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve, the fourth one, the trochlear nerve, abducent nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. You can see the distribution of their nuclei, the somatic motor nuclei. This is the oculomotor nucleus, this is the trochlear somatic motor nucleus, abducent somatic motor nucleus, and the hypoglossal somatic motor nucleus. According to the general rule, you can see all of them are located very close to the center here. And you can also see that the somatic motor nucleus of the oculomotor nerve lies at the level of the midbrain, at the superior colliculus level of the midbrain, and the trochlear nerve somatic motor nucleus lies at the inferior colliculus level of the midbrain, and the somatic motor nucleus of the abducent nerve lies underneath the facial colliculus here at the floor of the fourth ventricle, and the somatic motor nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve lies in the medulla, partly in the floor of the fourth ventricle, in the open part of the medulla, and going down into the closed medulla here. I will delete these before we move on to the next part. Now the branchial motor component in the head and neck region is carried in the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and the cranial root of the accessory nerve. You can see here in purple color the branchial motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and the branchial motor nucleus of the facial nerve under the facial colliculus, and a common nucleus, a single nucleus for all three other nerves: glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and the cranial root of accessory nerves. There is one single nucleus, which is actually called the nucleus of ambiguous. We will move on to the next component, the visceral motor component. I have indicated the nuclei in the visceral motor component in black color. The oculomotor nerve.
Now always remember in the brainstem, the moment we say visceral motor, it's parasympathetic. Okay, because there is no sympathetic in the brainstem. Okay, it's cranial outflow of parasympathetic. Okay.
Facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerves has got visceral motor component in them. You can see the visceral motor component of the visceral motor nucleus of the oculomotor nerve lying with the somatic motor nucleus at the superior colliculus level of the midbrain here. Then this is the visceral motor nucleus of the facial nerve, which is also called superior salivary nucleus, and this is the visceral motor nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is called the inferior salivary nucleus, and this is the visceral motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, which is also called the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. And there's another point that you need to remember here. Now in the brain there is no sympathetic outflow, therefore this visceral motor component actually you can, rather than calling it visceral motor, you can directly call it parasympathetic if you want, which is less confusing. Next one is the visceral sensory component. It is there in the facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerves, and both general visceral sensory and special visceral sensory, which is the taste, goes into the same nucleus, visceral sensory nucleus, which is a fairly long nucleus located here, which is actually named as nucleus of Tractus solitarius. Then the other one is the general somatic sensory, that is actually the trigeminal nucleus, which is a very long nucleus extending from the midbrain through the pons and the medulla to the spinal upper part of the spinal cord here, and it is actually carried in the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, but you can see some other nerves indicated here in the cage in a less prominent manner. This is actually to show that there are somatic sensory fibers arising from the skin, taking pain, temperature, etc. sensations, but these nerves actually has somatic sensory fibers hitchhiking in these nerves, but ultimately they will go into the trigeminal nucleus here. The trigeminal nucleus has three parts. We will discuss these three parts later when we go into details of it. The last component is the special somatic sensory component that is only present in the vestibulocochlear nerve. In the previous slide, we summarized the functional components of all cranial nerves in one go. Now we will take the separate functional components and see which cranial nerves contain these functional components one by one. Somatic motor component is found in oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, abducent nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. Third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves, they supply the extraocular muscles. And the 12th cranial nerve supplies the muscles of the tongue. At the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that certain structures, certain muscles in the head and neck region are supplied by somatic motor components, and these muscles develop from occipital myotomes. So these muscles, extraocular muscles and muscles of the tongue, belong to that category. Branchial motor component is found in the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, facial nerve, and 9, 10, and 11 cranial nerves. Mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve supplies the muscles of mastication through its branchial motor component. The branchial motor component of the facial nerve supplies muscles of facial expression. The branchial motor component of the 9, 10, and 11 cranial nerves supply pharyngeal and laryngeal muscles. Visceral motor component or the parasympathetic component is found in the oculomotor nerve, facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve. The parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve is called Edinger-Westphal nucleus or the accessory oculomotor nucleus, which is also found at the superior colliculus level of the midbrain. The parasympathetic nucleus of the facial nerve is called superior salivary nucleus. The parasympathetic nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve is called inferior salivary nucleus. And the parasympathetic nucleus of the vagus nerve is called dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. This dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve is responsible for parasympathetic supply of the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles of the alimentary tract. Visceral sensory nucleus is called nucleus of tractus solitarius, and this single nucleus receives both general and special visceral sensations. The term special visceral means taste sensations here. The nucleus of tractus solitarius receives taste sensations from the tongue through facial and the glossopharyngeal nerves. Facial nerve takes taste sensations from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and the glossopharyngeal nerve takes taste sensations from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. The nucleus of tractus solitarius receives general sensations from the heart, lungs, and other viscera through the vagus nerve. The general sensory from the tongue goes to the trigeminal nucleus through the lingual and glossopharyngeal nerves. There is only one general somatic sensory nucleus, which is the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Even though the general somatic sensations can travel through other cranial nerves as hitchhiking fibers, they ultimately end up in the somatic sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. This nucleus has three components: the mesencephalic part, which is there in the midbrain and the upper part of the pons, the main sensory nucleus in the pons, and the spinal nucleus from the pons through the medulla extending into the upper cervical spinal cord. The mesencephalic nucleus is responsible for proprioception. Main sensory nucleus receives touch sensations, and the spinal nucleus receives pain and temperature sensations. Again, there is only one special somatic sensory nucleus, which is the nucleus of the vestibulocochlear nerve for hearing.
I will explain something else before we finish this lecture. Now, about the nerve supply of the tongue, which is a very common question in exams. If this is your tongue, okay, you divide the tongue into an, say, we'll divide it like this: anterior 2/3 and a posterior 1/3. Okay, posterior 1/3. Now, number one, first thing you need to remember is that when it comes to motor supply of the tongue, that is the muscles of the tongue, almost all muscles of the tongue except one muscle are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve. Now the tongue muscles, if you read it, you will learn that there are two types of tongue muscles. There are intrinsic muscles and there are extrinsic muscles. Now the extrinsic muscles are muscles like hyoglossus, styloglossus, palatoglossus, like that. Okay. The intrinsic muscles are, there are, vertical muscles, then longitudinal ones, like that. Okay. So the intrinsic muscles, they change the shape of the tongue. Extrinsic muscles, they change the position of the tongue. So all these intrinsic and extrinsic muscles are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve except one muscle. So you can just forget about the exception. Just remember that all of them are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve. So that is number one. Number two, when it comes to the sensory supply of the tongue, the taste sensations from the anterior 2/3 is taken by coda tympani nerve. Okay. Taste sensations from the posterior 1/3 taken by the glossopharyngeal nerve. That is 9th cranial nerve. Okay. So this coda tympani nerve is part of the 7th cranial nerve. It's a part of the 7th cranial nerve. So one can say that it's taken by the facial nerve, but don't say at this stage it's taken by the facial nerve, because the coda tympani joins facial nerve at a later stage. So it's the coda tympani nerve of the facial nerve that takes taste sensations from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Then when it comes to general sensations from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, it is taken by the lingual nerve. Lingual nerve is a branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Okay. Then when it comes to the general sensations from the posterior 1/3 is the same nerve that takes it, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay. So this is the summary of the nerve supply of the tongue. If somebody asks you to describe the nerve supply of the tongue, then what you should do is first you should talk about the motor supply of the tongue, which is basically the hypoglossal nerve. Then you talk about the sensory supply. You divide it into, first you divide the tongue into an anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3 before you describe the sensory supply. Anterior 2/3 taste from the coda tympani part of the facial nerve. Posterior 1/3 taste from the glossopharyngeal nerve. Anterior 2/3 general sensations like pain, temperature, touch from the lingual nerve, which is a branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. From the posterior 1/3, general sensations are taken from the same nerve that takes taste from the posterior 1/3, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve.